At Thanksgiving, Dad said, "Your brother's wedding was great. When's yours?" That question shattered a lifetime of buried memories. Strange footsteps, missing years, faces no one recalls, yet I remember everything. And this time, the past is knocking back. Before we dive in, make sure to hit subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a chilling story like this. Smash that like button and drop a comment. I want to hear what you think happened before the truth unfolds. My name is Evelyn Hartman, and sometimes I think my voice is the only thing left that still belongs to me. 79 years of memories, some sharp as needles, others dulled by time, but none of them ever truly leave. I was born in the farmhouse on Willow Hill, white paint peeling even back then. A wraparound porch that creaked like it had secrets of its own. And windows that faced the orchard our father tended with near religious devotion. People like to say Kingfisher was quiet, peaceful, the kind of town where trouble only lived in stories told to children. But trouble lived in our house. It had roots in our soil. It breathed in the walls. Daniel was the shining star, the boy who could do no wrong. Blonde hair, easy smile, the kind of laugh that made people lean in and want more. I adored him the way little sisters often adore their older brothers, but even as a child, I sensed he shone a bit too brightly for father's liking. Henry Hartman didn't trust anything he couldn't control. And Daniel, sweet, restless Daniel, couldn't be contained. Not even by a man like him. Our mother vanished from the picture before I could form a memory of her face. The grown-ups in town said cancer. Father said nothing at all. Daniel used to whisper that she simply went away, and the way he said it always made me shiver. We grew up under father's rules, the most important of which was never, under any circumstance, to go into the locked barn behind the orchard. "It's dangerous," he said. "Tools, chemicals, sharp things. You stay out." I believed him at first, children do, but the older I got, the more I noticed how he flinched when the wind rattled the barn doors. How he tightened his jaw when Daniel even looked in its direction, but none of that frightened me as much as the night I woke at 8 years old and saw her. She stood at the foot of my bed like she'd been carved. Out of the darkness itself, soaked, dripping onto the floorboards. Her hair hanging in heavy ropes over her face. I remember sitting up slowly, convinced that if I breathed too loudly she would fade like smoke. But she didn't. She lifted her head, just enough for me to glimpse the outline of a mouth. "Evelyn," she whispered, her voice like wet leaves dragged across the ground. "Don't go into the barn. Not again." I opened my mouth to scream, but sound didn't come. When I blinked, just once, she was gone, leaving my window open, the curtains billowing like they were trying to escape. I ran to father's room, sobbing. He didn't hold me. He didn't ask questions. He just stared at my window, his face turning the color of old stone, and said, "You were sleepwalking." The next day, he boarded up the window. Hammered the nails in himself. Daniel watched from the hallway, his expression caught somewhere between fear and recognition. For years I tried to convince myself it had been a dream. A night terror. Childhood imagination. But dreams don't chill a room to the point you can see your breath. Dreams don't leave muddy footprints on the boards below your bed, footprints father scrubbed before I could point them out. Dreams don't make your brother suddenly avoid eye contact whenever you bring up the barn, and I might have convinced myself it was all in my mind, truly, if not for what happened 30 years later. I was 40, divorced, and sorting through father's old papers after he passed. A storm rattled the windows, much like that night, and I opened an envelope I swear I had never seen before. Inside was a photograph, black and white, grainy, the edges curled with age. It showed the interior of the locked barn. Dusty rafters. Rotted beams. And there, standing in the center of the frame, was the woman from my childhood, still drenched, still faceless. Still waiting. She hadn't been a dream, and someone had taken that photograph. Daniel was already a legend by the time I turned 17, quarterback. Homecoming king, the kind of boy who made teachers beam and parents say, "Why can't you be more like that?" I didn't mind being overshadowed. I preferred it, honestly. While the world cheered for him, I slipped unnoticed into the orchard with a book, settling beneath the oldest apple tree, the one with a trunk split like a crooked grin. That orchard was the only place where the air didn't feel tight around me. Where father's rules and the barn's looming presence didn't suffocate the breath right out of my lungs. That's where I first saw her. Nora Hale. She appeared as softly as fog rolling between branches, thin, pale, with gray eyes that seemed to absorb everything and reveal nothing. Her dress was always a little out of season, too thin for the cold days, too heavy for the warm ones. She'd sit a few feet away, legs tucked under her, hands folded in her lap as though she were waiting to be invited into the world. She never told me where she lived. Every time I asked, she'd smile faintly, tilt her head, and say, "Around." But she listened to me. And she remembered things. Even things I didn't remember telling her. On foggy afternoons, she'd ask questions, about my dreams, about the boarded window I never talked about the barn. She had a way of speaking that made you lean in even when you wanted to walk away. And I admit, there was a strange comfort in her presence, the way she seemed to understand the parts of me I didn't say out loud. Daniel met her once, only once, and afterward he pulled me aside and told me to be careful. Daniel, who never cared who I spent time with. Daniel, who never worried unless he had a reason. I should have listened. One evening the fog was so thick the world felt drowned in it. Nora stood behind me without making a sound, as if she'd risen from the ground itself. She touched my shoulder, colder than the air, and said, "Your father isn't protecting you from the barn. He's protecting what's inside from you." Then she stepped back, disappearing between trees like a shadow slipping under a door, leaving me with that terrible sentence echoing in my mind. I walked home with trembling hands, trying to make sense of her words. But nothing prepared me for what I saw when I reached the porch. Through the kitchen window, Father stood with Sheriff Miriam Dalton and Pastor Reeve, two people who rarely shared space unless someone had died. Their voices were sharp, clipped, urgent. Pastor Reeve kept glancing toward the orchard. The sheriff shook her head like she was refusing something she didn't want to refuse. Father wasn't arguing. He looked afraid. Truly afraid. And that unsettled me more than any raised voice could have. When they left, Father locked the door behind them, then went straight to the sink. I watched from the hallway as he opened a drawer and pulled out a stack of letters tied with twine. His hands shook as he cut the string. One by one, he dropped the letters into the basin and struck a match. Flames sprang up, hungry, devouring paper and secrets alike. The room smelled of smoke and something sour, something old. I wanted to step forward, to ask what he was burning, but something deep in me knew I wouldn't like the answer. As he fed the last envelope into the fire, a gust from the open window fluttered the flames. One envelope tumbled out, landing on the floor near my feet. Father didn't notice. When he went to bed, I picked it up. My name was written on the front in looping handwriting I knew instantly. I didn't want to believe it, but there it was, unmistakable, Nora Hale. The postmark read 1953. The year we met. The year I turned 17. But Nora was never near a mailbox that year. She never left the orchard. She never carried a purse, let alone a letter, and as I held that envelope, the truth settled over me like the fog she always walked out of, silent, suffocating, and impossible to ignore. I was 22 when life finally felt like it had shifted into something soft, something hopeful. Carter Whitlow was the first person who ever looked at me like I wasn't a shadow standing next to Daniel's spotlight. He was gentle in a way that didn't feel fragile, bookish without being timid, the kind of man who held a door not out of habit but because he believed small kindnesses mattered. He worked at the town library, wore shirts that always seemed a bit too big, and had a smile that made me feel like I was stepping into warm sunlight. I loved him. God, I loved him so deeply it frightened me. We married in the fall of '67, leaves turning the color of fire and the orchard smelling of sweet rotten cider. It should have been perfect. Except, something clung to the edges of that day. A wrongness I couldn't name. At the courthouse, the clerk squinted at our documents, flipping through them as if seeing them for the first time. "Strange," she murmured. "I don't remember filing this." Another clerk was called over. Then another. They studied the signatures like archaeologists examining a relic that shouldn't exist. "Maybe it slipped through the cracks," Carter whispered, squeezing my hand, but the look the clerks exchanged said otherwise. Father refused to come to the ceremony. He didn't offer a reason. He just said, "Evelyn, this is a mistake," and shut the door before I could ask what he meant. Daniel tried to bridge the distance between us, but even he seemed uneasy, watching the orchard like something inside it might leap out. For a few brief months, Carter and I made a home out of small joys, morning coffee, shared novels, whispered dreams in the dark. But the orchard always loomed behind our house. Carter claimed the apples tasted sweeter on that side of town, yet he never stepped deeper than the first 2 rows. And sometimes, when the fog was thick, he'd stand at the window like he was listening for something. I told myself it was the wind. I lied to myself often in those days. The night Carter vanished was unremarkable at first. He kissed my forehead, said he'd be home before 10, and drove off in his old blue sedan. I waited by the lamp we always left on, the one that flickered whenever the weather changed. 10 came. Then 11. Then midnight. My pulse sank to the ticking clock until the sheriff knocked on my door, hat in hand. Face carved with pity. They found his car parked on the old bridge, driver's door wide open. Headlights casting long pale beams into the river below. Engine running. Radio humming static. But no Carter. Not a footprint on the bridge. Not a scuff in the dirt. Nothing. As if he stepped out of the car and simply dissolved. People in Kingfisher whispered, the way they always did. Maybe he ran off. Maybe he fell. But the orchard folk, those who lived closest to Willow Hill, said something else entirely. They said the orchard had swallowed him. That the fog had a hunger. That the barn sometimes called to people the way a wound calls to a blade. Father boarded up the barn completely the next morning. Not just the doors, every window, every slat, every crack where light could pass. Daniel helped him, though he kept looking at me with an expression that seemed to apologize for something he couldn't explain, and grief made time heavy. Days blurred. I stopped sleeping in the bedroom because every time I closed my eyes, I heard footsteps pacing the hallway with a rhythm just slightly off from Carter's. A week after he disappeared, I found a note beneath my pillow. The paper was cold. Damp, almost. My name, Evie, written in a looping, deliberate hand. I'm still here, Evie. Don't let them close the door. Siamese breath caught in my throat. The signature looked like his initial, but everything else, every curve, every flourish, wasn't him. Carter's handwriting leaned left. This leaned right. Carter wrote quickly. This looked like it had been carved slowly, deliberately, and yet I felt watched, somehow. Known. As though someone, or something, had been close enough to tuck it beneath my head as I slept. I spent most of my 30s behind the front desk of the Kingfisher Public Library, stamping return dates and shelving books no one read anymore. It was quiet work, steady work, the kind that let you disappear into the rhythm of days without drawing too much attention. People liked me fine, but they always seemed to look through me, as if I were a ghost wandering the stacks instead of a woman with a life, a history, a marriage no one believed existed. Daniel, meanwhile, lived in a world of bright lights and applause. Promotions at the bank, photo spreads in the Kingfisher Gazette, a rotating cast of girlfriends who adored his charm. When we walked down Main Street together, strangers greeted him by name and nodded at me politely, like I was tagging along rather than sharing his blood. Thanksgiving became the cruelest tradition. Father insisted we gather every year in the old farmhouse on Willow Hill, even after most of the shutters sagged and the chimney groaned like something trapped inside it. The table was always set perfectly, as if Mother still hovered over the details, but the air carried a tension thick enough to taste. Daniel would carve the turkey with that easy grin of his, talking about work and the people he'd met. I'd sit across from Father, trying to shrink into the wallpaper as he watched me with that same tight-lipped disapproval he'd worn since I was old enough to question him, and without fail. After the plates were scraped clean and the candles burned low, he'd clear his throat and ask, "When are you getting married, Evie?" I never corrected him aloud. I only murmured in my head, "I already did. I already lost him. I already searched for him until my legs went numb." But the moment I echoed those words outside my mind, just once, just one Thanksgiving, I watched both their faces turn to stone. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, like he wished he could sink beneath the table. Father didn't blink. He simply said, "We've discussed this," in a tone that made my stomach drop, but we hadn't discussed it. Not once. Because any time I brought up Carter, Father's eyes went dull and blank, the way a person's eyes go when they're pretending not to hear. It didn't matter what I said. No one remembered Carter. No one recalled meeting him at the library, or seeing us in town, or hearing our vows. Even those who attended the wedding looked confused when I mentioned it years later. "I think you're mixing things up," they'd mutter. "Are you sure you're not remembering someone else?" Someone else. As if a husband could be misfiled in memory like a misshelved book. It was archivist Judith Snow who finally took my confusion seriously. Judith was sharp, practical, and held the county records with the devotion of a dragon guarding treasure. One day, she pulled me into her office and shut the door behind us. "I checked the marriage registry," she whispered, as though the walls might be listening. "There's something odd." She opened the leather-bound log and pointed to a page that made my blood turn cold. The entry numbers were sequential, 1128, 1129, 1130, but between 1129 and 1130 was a blank stretch of paper, perfectly white. "This should be where your marriage record sits," she said. "But look closer. The page hasn't been torn out. It's still attached to the binding." I leaned in. The paper fibers were intact, smooth, undisturbed, except for the faintest impression, as if ink had once stained the page but had been pulled back out of existence. Erased. Not scratched out or whited over. Erased in a way paper shouldn't allow. Judith's voice dropped even lower. "I don't know who did this. Or how." She tucked the binder under her arm and told me she'd look deeper. That she'd cross-reference duplicates, old backups, anything that might leave a trace. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of hope, small but real. The next morning, she didn't show up for work. By noon, the county clerk called me, her voice shaking. "Judith's not missing," she said, "but she's rattled." Rattled turned out to mean terrified. When I found Judith sitting in her dim office, she refused to touch the binder, refused even to look at the shelves where it had been stored. "It's gone," she whispered. "The whole thing vanished." I tried to steady her, but her hands trembled uncontrollably. She kept staring toward the front entrance, as though replaying something she couldn't process. Finally, in a voice so thin I almost didn't hear it, she said, "I saw your father." Evelyn, he was speaking to a man in a brown suit. And he was holding the registry. The farmhouse felt smaller in my 50s, as though the walls had bowed inward under the weight of all the secrets they'd watched unfold. After father died, the house became mine by default. Daniel wanted nothing to do with it. He said the place made him feel watched, but he didn't have to tell me that. I saw how he avoided looking toward the orchard even as an adult, how he flinched whenever the wind blew from that direction. Everyone in town encouraged me to sell. Too much history, they said. Bad air. Bad memories. But I needed the truth more than I needed peace. The first storm of November rolled in like a creature dragging chains. Wind hammered the windows. Branches snapped like knuckles cracking in the dark. I'd poured myself tea and sat in father's old chair, trying to make sense of the silence in the house without him. That was when I heard it, footsteps in the orchard. Heavy, measured, familiar. The same cadence father used when he walked from the barn to the house. Hands behind his back, boots sinking into the wet earth. I froze. No one else should have been on that property. And yet the rhythm was unmistakable, steady as a heartbeat. I grabbed a lantern and went outside, the storm whipping my coat around my legs. The orchard swayed like a forest of restless giants. The steps continued until I reached the clearing. Then they stopped. The barn door, locked my entire life, boarded, chained, sealed, stood slightly open. Just an inch. But that was enough to feel the breath of cold air slipping through, as though something inside had been holding its lungs for years and had finally exhaled. I don't know how I moved forward. Curiosity or fear or the lingering echo of Nora Hale's warning, don't let them close the door. My hand reached out before I could stop myself, and I pushed the door open with a groan that sounded far too human. Inside, the barn smelled of old dust and damp secrets. Lantern light shook in my hand as I swept it across shelves I'd never imagined were there, rows and rows of journals, bound in cracked leather. Dates stretching back to the 1920s. Father's handwriting filled the spines like a catalog of things he never wanted spoken aloud. I opened the first journal. Then another. And another. Evelyn must never remember what she was part of, one entry read in jagged ink. The door must stay closed. Then, beneath it, as though added later, Carter was a mistake. My breath came sharp and painful. A mistake. Not a tragedy. Not a loss. A mistake. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the far wall, and for the first time, I realized the barn was deeper than I remembered. At the very back stood a display that felt wrong the moment I saw it, a wall of framed photographs. All neatly arranged as though someone curated them for decades. Each photograph showed 3 people, father, Daniel, and me, but in every single picture, standing just slightly apart from us, was a 4th person. A silhouette blurred beyond recognition, face smudged, body half translucent. As if someone had tried to erase them from history but failed to finish the job. I stepped closer. The frames rattled softly, as if disturbed by my presence. The photos spanned years, holidays, corn harvests, family picnics, even Daniel's first football trophy. Always the same 3 of us. Always the same faded 4th figure. My hand shook as I reached the oldest photo at the bottom corner. The caption etched into the frame said Willow Hill Harvest Festival, 1939. But I wasn't born until 1940. I lifted the lantern higher, bringing the picture into full light. Father looked young, too young. Daniel wasn't there at all. Instead, it was just father and a woman whose face had been burned out of the image entirely. And beside them, the blurred silhouette stood tall, outlined clearly despite the distortion, wearing a long white gown, the exact gown I wore the day Carter and I stood before the courthouse. A wedding dress I hadn't owned yet. A wedding dress I hadn't even imagined. A wedding dress captured in a photograph taken before I existed, and it fit the silhouette perfectly. Detective Avery Quinn was the kind of man who carried the weight of other people's tragedies in the slope of his shoulders. By the time I reached 60, I'd learned to expect polite dismissals whenever I mentioned Carter, the barn, the missing records. But Avery didn't treat me like a confused old woman. He listened. Really listened. And when I finished retelling the story I'd repeated for almost 4 decades, he closed his notebook slowly and said, "I'll look. Off the record. But Evelyn, you may not like what we find." For weeks he dug through old witness lists, wedding registries, county logs, anything that might confirm Carter had ever stood beside me under the lanterns we strung in the backyard. People remembered fragments. A few recalled music drifting through the orchard at dusk, the flicker of candlelight, the smell of cider. One elderly neighbor swore she remembered clapping as someone kissed the bride. But when Avery asked to see photographs, recordings, invitations, anything tangible, their expressions faltered. "I know I saw it," one woman said, "but maybe I'm misremembering." Another insisted she'd been there, only to admit she couldn't recall a single face, and every time Avery tried to follow the trail, it ended the same way, with blank pages, erased files, or logs that seemed to have been rewritten by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. *I. Was sorting through old letters one evening when I felt a change in the air, like the temperature dipped just enough for my breath to fog. I looked up, and there she was, framed in the doorway, Nora Hale. She looked exactly as she had when I was 17. Her gray eyes unchanged. Her posture unchanged. Her hair the same dark, wet tangle as on those fog-soaked afternoons. Time had not touched her. Not a line, not a wrinkle, not a shadow of age. It felt like seeing a photograph step off the page.
"You shouldn't be here," I whispered, but she stepped forward with a calm that made my skin tighten. "Your life has been rewritten more than once," she said, her voice soft, steady. "Wrong. Stop looking for Carter. Find the man who keeps erasing him." 1,000 questions lodged in my throat, but she didn't give me a chance. She only brushed the back of her cold hand against my cheek, a gesture almost tender, and said, "He won't let you keep your memories much longer." Then she turned and vanished down the hall, leaving the smell of rain and something metallic lingering behind. My phone rang moments later. "Daniel." His voice cracked before he even said my name. "Evelyn, listen to me. Don't hang up. Someone broke into Father's old files at the law office." I heard papers rustling, drawers slamming, Daniel's breath quick and panicked. "They didn't take money, didn't touch the wills. They only took one thing." "What?" There was a beat of silence. "Then, your marriage certificate." I felt myself go cold. The house seemed to tighten around me, like the walls had leaned in to eavesdrop. "Daniel," I whispered, "who would even know where that was filed?" "I don't know," he said, but his voice said otherwise. He knew something. Maybe he'd always known. "The police are coming back to dust the room." There was something left behind. "What?" The word scraped out of me. "A footprint," he said, "in the carpet. Deep enough it had to be fresh. And Evelyn," his voice dropped to a tremor, "it matches Carter's size exactly." I gripped the phone so tightly, my knuckles cracked. The storm outside rattled the window pane, but the sound felt distant, muted, like I was hearing it underwater. My vision blurred at the edges, as a truth I'd spent years outrunning began to take shape slowly, heavily. If someone had the power to erase my marriage, my memories, the proof of a man's existence, what else could they reach? What else had they rewritten? What if Carter hadn't disappeared at all? What if he had been taken, or worse, kept, and the only hint he could leave behind, after all these years, was the imprint of a single step? Daniel's new lake house glittered like something out of a magazine. Glass walls, polished floors, a dining table long enough for 20. It didn't resemble the boyhood home on Willow Hill, or the life we'd grown inside its crooked bones. It felt sterilized, orchestrated, a place where the truth couldn't breathe. He'd just come back from his big second wedding in Florida. White sand, sunset photos, a bride with a smile too bright to last. The celebration had been the talk of Kingfisher for weeks. My own wedding, meanwhile, lived only in the hollow between my ribs. Everyone chatted over wine and sweet potatoes, pretending the air wasn't too heavy, pretending the lake outside didn't swallow sound the way the orchard used to. Cousin Lucas, father's old friend who always drank too much, raised his glass and bellowed. To Daniel, the first Hartman to settle down, the table burst into laughter. Forks clinked, napkins dabbed lips that whispered jokes not worth remembering. And Daniel, smug in the glow of attention, leaned back in his chair, locked eyes with me, and said, "Evelyn, when's your wedding?" My fork slipped from my fingers and hit the plate with a sharp, accusing ring. My hands trembled not with fear, but with the kind of fury that grows roots. I stared at him, at the man who used to protect me from nightmares, now smirking like he was in on one. Maybe he was. I stood so fast my chair groaned. Every face turned toward me, expressions sliding from amusement into unease. Even the lake went still behind the windows. "I had mine," I said, my voice louder than I expected, "and you all just made sure no one remembers it." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Daniel's smile fell. His wife stared between us with widening eyes. Cousin Lucas blinked, confused, like he'd forgotten the script everyone else agreed to follow. A few cousins exchanged glances that whispered, "Don't start this again, Evelyn." But I didn't care. I could feel something rising in me, something that had slept for years beneath layers of doubt and manipulation. The truth wanted out. The knock at the door made half the table. Jumped. It was sharp, urgent, wrong for a night meant for gratitude.
Daniel muttered, "Who the hell?" as he crossed the room. I watched his silhouette stretch across the polished floor. Watched him pause before opening the door, like he already feared what was on the other side. Sheriff Miriam Dalton stood on the threshold, soaked from the lake wind, a manila folder clutched to her chest. Her face was a shade paler than I'd ever seen it. She didn't greet anyone, didn't apologize for the intrusion. Her eyes went straight to me. "Evelyn," she whispered, stepping inside. "We found something in the lake." My pulse hammered against my ribs. Daniel blocked her path, as though trying to shield me or himself. She brushed past him anyway, and placed the dripping folder into my hands. Wet paper. Silt. The faint smell of algae and metal. "Open it," she said. My fingers fumbled, but I managed to peel it open. Inside was a single object. A water-damaged ID card, sealed in a plastic evidence sleeve. The kind issued recently, not decades ago. The kind with holograms, that caught the light. My knees nearly buckled. It was Carter's. His name. His signature. His address, one that hadn't existed when he disappeared. But the issuance date at the bottom corner, last month. Daniel cursed under his breath. Someone gasped. The room felt like it tilted, reality bending, like heat rising off asphalt. But the photograph, God, the photograph. It showed Carter exactly as he'd looked at 27. The same shy, brilliant smile. The same hair falling across his forehead. Not aged. Not altered. Not even a line beneath his eyes. Exactly as if he had stepped out of the past. Or never left it. The lanterns of our wedding flickered in my memory. The orchard fog pressed against the windows of my mind. And Nora Hale's voice whispered through the cracks of time like wind curling under a door. "Your life has been rewritten more than once. Stop looking for Carter. Because Carter, somehow, impossibly, was still out there. And whoever kept erasing him had just made a mistake. I used to think silence was safety. That if I stayed quiet long enough, the past would lose interest in me, and slip back into whatever dark corner it crawled out of. But tonight proved how foolish that hope was. At 79, in this little condo, overlooking a parking lot instead of an orchard. I thought I had outrun the ghosts of Willow Hill. Most of the people from those days are gone. Father, Pastor, Reeve, Lucas, even half the neighbors who once whispered about the barn. Daniel calls every few months, but he never mentions the farmhouse, or the lake, or our childhood. He speaks like a man terrified that a single wrong word could crack the veneer he's built around his life. For years I told myself I imagined things. That grief warped memory. That the fear I carried was a relic of a lonely, confused girl who misunderstood her own childhood. But tonight, the truth walked straight to my door. It was 11:58 p.m. I know that because the clock on the wall had just clicked from 11:57 when the first knock sounded. 3 slow, deliberate taps. Not urgent, not hesitant. Like someone certain I was awake and waiting. The hallway was quiet when I approached the door. My slippers whispered across the rug. I placed my hand on the knob and paused, listening for footsteps, voices, anything to hint at who waited on the other side. Nothing. Silence so deep, it pressed against my eardrums. I opened the door. A man stood there, dripping wet, water pooling around his shoes, soaking into the welcome mat I bought at a dollar store. His suit was the same gray one he'd worn the night he vanished, though the fabric looked as though it had traveled through decades of storms. His hair clung to his forehead, his tie loosened just the slightest, like he'd driven straight from a long day at work and stepped through the wrong doorway in time. Carter, exactly as he looked at 20-7, not aged, not pale, not translucent. Alive. For a moment, my breath stalled in my chest, and the world narrowed to the quiet rise and fall of his shoulders. His eyes, still that soft, steady brown, met mine. And everything inside me went painfully still. "Evie," he said, voice warm, unchanged. They can't erase me anymore. My knees nearly gave out. I gripped the doorframe to keep from collapsing. Carter stepped closer, concern flickering across his face, the way it used to when I got dizzy after standing too fast. The familiarity of it shattered something in me. I wanted to fall into him. Let him carry the weight I'd held alone for half a century. But before I could speak, before I could even reach for him, another presence entered the dim hallway. A second shadow stretched across the carpet, long and deliberate. Nora Hale. She stepped into view with the same unearthly calm she always had. Her gray eyes glinted like fog catching moonlight. Not a wrinkle, not a mark of age. She looked exactly as she had under the apple trees when I was 17. The same dark dress, the same hair falling in damp waves, the same expression of knowing more than she ever said. Ready to finish the wedding, she murmured. It's still waiting for you. Her voice rippled through the room, and for a moment the air around me shimmered like heat rising from asphalt, or the shimmer you see above water right before something breaks the surface. The condo seemed to tilt, its edges softening, shadows stretching into shapes I half recognized from another lifetime. I tore my gaze from Nora and looked back at Carter. He was holding something, a small object cradled in his hand, glinting faintly beneath the hallway light. My breath caught when I saw it. My old wedding ring, thin, gold worn smooth from years of worryand inside it. The engraving the county records never showed, the date no one believed existed. October 14, 1967. The day the candles flickered in the orchard. The day the photograph vanished. The day someone decided to rewrite my life. It's still yours, Carter whispered, his voice trembling just enough to prove this moment was real. If you want it. Behind him, the hallway seemed to darken not with threat, but with possibility. A strange, impossible invitation. The air smelled faintly of apples and rain-soaked earth. The scent of home. My heart hammered against my ribs. A rhythm older than memory. For the first time in 50 years, I wasn't afraid. I stepped forward.